Darwin Millard. It is so good to have you here on MyFlora Fridays. You and I have been connected for, I don't know, a couple of years now, at least through the socials. And we actually got to hang out at a conference this past year, which was awesome. Had so much fun with you. So, first and foremost, you know you better than I know you. So, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, and at first, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and fortunate to be among some of the first of your interviewees, your podcasters, or whatever the right terminology is. But yeah, so who am I? Well, I'm colloquially known as the Spock of cannabis in industry, which I'm really happy about. I got coined that by a colleague in ASTM International, which is a standards development group that I volunteer on because of how I approach the standards development process in a very logical and cold and calculated way, similar to, I guess, a Vulcan. So, but I've certainly a term of endearment, I think. I'm an 18-year industry veteran. I got into the cannabis space at a really amazing time as an individual. The only career I've ever had or like real job has been working in the cannabis industry in a legal context. I feel super fortunate to have been in the right time to be able to say that, right? But I'm a mechanical engineer by training. And for me, it was either design and build slurry pumps for the fracking industry, which didn't sound like fun at all and still doesn't. And so really it was like, okay, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to dive headfirst into the super fledgling legal medical space that we had at the time in Colorado. And I wouldn't change it for the world. You know, we had caregivers back then, right? And you had a piece of paper on the wall with all the patients that you grew for, right? And that's how we did it. That's how it started. Being an engineer, having and a consumer, and being passionate about good quality product and doing it efficiently, I figured out there was a way to help people understand how to do things more efficiently. I've always been looking toward kind of an eye to the future for safety and quality. I became a consultant and helped people figure out how to make extract. And then once you had a whole bunch of extract, what do you do with that? Turn it into products. And that gave me an amazing ride to travel the world. I spent a lot of time in India, about 4 years off and on, setting up one of the world's largest phytocannabinoid extraction facilities back when everybody thought CBD was going to be like the thing and you could get maybe $100,000 a kilo for that. You just can't anymore. People are basically giving away CBD at this point, right? So certainly has been an interesting change in everything. Another just small anecdote about myself. That was actually a part of the team that created the very first legal CBD dietary supplement from hemp, and that was right around 2012. This was about the same time as Sanjay Gupta's Weed One special with Charlotte Figge, right, in the realm of caring and all of that initial, like, I guess, uh, tsunami of evidence, right, that medical cannabis is a thing and it does real good for people. So that was an amazing thing in having created this product that was available to people who were not in medical states. So you could get your CBD under hemp in other places. And since this crazy journey, I've been chief science officer for a number of different groups on a contract, bounced around the world. But my main thing that I love now and do is I volunteer half of my time with ASTM International, as I mentioned earlier, D37, creating standards for the global cannabis industry, hopefully lower barriers and create a real global commodities market. And then the other half of my time is at CSQ, where we take standards and turn those into certification programs. And our whole thing is safety and quality and ensuring the supply chain for cannabis and cannabinoid products, whether they're classified as regulatorily classified as marijuana or hemp or a food or a drug. We want to provide a safety and quality management certification program for licensed operators. So I am in a super fortunate place where I get to do what I love. My passion is safety and quality, right? As a consumer, and I get to work in a job that's like, okay, here's this, go make it happen. So that's me.
Nice. What do those letters stand for? Because I didn't look it up and I was reading about it. It makes sense to me. It's some sort of standards, right? But what does it stand for and what and I know it's yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's a great question, right? Because usually when you see a letter acronym, you're like, what does that mean? ASTM technically doesn't stand for anything anymore. ASTM International is a brand name for an entity, a non-government organization, right? And a nonprofit that's been, I think they're just over 127 some odd years old, right? And they started as the American Society for Testing and Materials.
Okay.
And that acronym truncated and went away, and they became ASTM International in the 70s and rebranded essentially so that they could compete with groups like ISO, the International Standards Organization, right, to create international standards.
Mhm. Okay. Awesome. Thanks for explaining that. Now, like when I think of standards in my brain, I think chemistry standards,
Yep.
chemicals that you put into your HPLC to
Yep.
compare anything else that's in your sample next to. But then I also think standards, like standards of doing things. So, in a lab, you have protocols, you follow a standard protocol. So I get confused about when we talk about standards, exactly which direction my brain should take me in.
Yep. Great, great, great question. So in ASTM world, right, we've got six types of standards. Oop, there we go. Yep, six standards. You've got terminology, which I think in this case is
Mm,
really important, right? So that we all speak the same language about a technical subject, right?
mm,
There's classifications for
mm,
things, so you can group them, right? And then you've got, so in order to group them, you have specifications. And then in order to actually say a thing is that class or grade or category, you have a test method. So those four types of standards, right? So terminology, classifications, specifications, and test methods all work really well together. How you can see how you would test to validate a spec, to then grade or classify something. And so you can appropriately call it that thing and sell it in the market for the value you want. And then there are two other standards. We have guides and practices. So a practice are like explicit steps to get to an end goal. So you might have a practice for cleaning something or whatever, but it's similar to a test method, but there's no there you're not doing like a specific analysis for something. Practice is more like how to weigh something right or how to torque something correctly, right?
or like something you might put in an SOP.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
That's what a practice would be. Whereas a guide is suggestions. Like, hey, here's some information that's good to know. Use that as you would to maybe create a practice or, an SOP from. So that's in ASTM world, six types of standards, right? But in chemistry, you have reference materials and certified reference materials, which you call your standards. And that's where I think terminology, how they play together there.
Okay. As you probably know, I mean, terminology is one of my things that I like to talk about because in the cannabis industry, it seems like, I don't know, I mean, I'm not in any other industries, but in the cannabis industry specifically, there are so many terms that people use differently in different contexts. Like, for example, I was talking to Murphy Murray the other day, and she was talking about washing. What makes a good washer in terms of extractions? When I think of washing, I think of post harvest washing your flowers before drying them so that you can, reduce a spore count or, get rid of any dust, dirt, debris from your flower because growing, a lot of people don't bother indoors because you're not really, open to the elements. But outdoor flowers or hoop house flowers can get pretty dirty. So it's kind of it's I wouldn't say it's a common practice, but it is a practice for people to wash their flower. So when people talk about washing, it's like, which way does my brain go? Indica sativa. Who are we talking to? If you're talking to a consumer, they don't care what the morphology of the plant looks like. They're talking about the indica sativa effects. If you're talking to a cultivator or a taxonomist, those terms mean something completely different. And I feel like there's a lot of places in the cannabis industry where terminology crosses and means different things to different people and is starting to create confusion. And I think, let's talk about this. The latest and greatest over the last year, 2 years has been hemp, right? So I don't know if you want to expand on any of that sort of terminology business that's going on and what you kind of have noticed in your space.
So I love it because it gives me an opportunity to kind of talk about a really cool tool that ASTM uses, right? So in Webster's dictionary or other dictionaries, they may define a word multiple times using like letter designations, right? So they'll define a term. In this case, it's
Mhm.
A, right? And in this case, it's B, and they're two totally different definitions. And in ASTM, we structure that using a delineating phrase. So we delineate between the two different usage cases or scenarios or otherwise, right? When the term is used. And that's, I think, more and more becoming relevant, especially in our space when we have things like marijuana and hemp, cannabis, et cetera, right? How do we use those terms? Which of those terms are most appropriate? And how do you use that word now knowing like you just say hemp, that gets very nebulous really quickly. What do you mean by that? Right.
Yeah.
So we start to need more words now, not fewer, to really, really, or to clearly describe what we're trying to talk about. A cannabinoid product is a great example of a new word phrase that we've been kind of throwing it out there that describes a new type of product, right? Not necessarily a new type of product, but a new way of thinking about it, right? A different context of framing it. We have cannabinoid products. Cannabinoid products can be made from cannabinoids that are natural, semi-synthetic, or synthetic, right? Which are ways to classify the cannabinoid ingredient, right, that was used to make the cannabinoid product. So, but can we also know that maybe a cannabinoid product isn't something where I'm going to take ingredients and make it. Maybe it's an herbal material like the flowers, right? That already has cannabinoids in it. So it's contained or it comprises of the flower material. So cannabinoid products can also be cannabinoid herbal materials or cannabinoid source materials or cannabinoid herbal source materials, right? That you might use to extract to get what? Cannabinoid substances from those. So it's just a
Right.
framing, right, of what we're already talking about as this thing that has cannabinoids in it. And then we can put different modifiers, qualifiers, adjectives, right, in front of
Mhm.
those terms to help us then know, okay, is it a hemp derived cannabinoid product or is it an intoxicating hemp derived cannabinoid product? But that doesn't, and that's, I guess, ways we can use words to better communicate between ourselves,
Mhm.
especially around this complex topic of what is hemp in general as a concept or otherwise.
That's yeah, I had somebody ask me or we were talking about a product that was going to be potentially provided for guests at a venue, and the supplier said, "Don't worry, it's just hemp." And the event coordinator came to me and said, "What do they mean by that?" And I was like, I have no idea. Like, there are so many things that could be. It could be, like, literally, it could be CBD flower, no problem. It could be THCA hemp. It could be something that was made from CBD into an intoxicating product like D9 or D8 or D10 or HHC or THCP or any of the other cannabinoids. And so that's like a really, like, yeah, when somebody says, "Oh, it's just hemp." Like, my brain explodes. I have no idea what you mean by that. Do you have a
Yeah.
CLA I can look at to try and figure out what it is you're talking about? Because even just a hemp pre-roll, still, that doesn't give me any good information about what that product is or what the effects are going to be from consuming that product, right?
Yeah. And all it really tells you is how it's regulatorily classified.
Mm,
It
that's a
doesn't
good
tell you anything else. And what I've been challenging people to think about recently is re-looking or looking at this regulatory structure and landscape that we have as ways of classifying products. So, kind of going back to the whole cannabinoid product, right? Cannabinoid products can be many, many things. They can be intoxicating, non-intoxicating. You can inhale them, you can ingest them, right? And all that helps you understand the specific safety and quality standards, right? You would need to apply to a product that has cannabinoids in it and is for inhalation, right? Then how that is used in the marketplace or and it access to the marketplace, that's where you start getting, is it regulatorily classified as hemp or is it regulatorily classified as cannabis or otherwise, right? That's where you can start then applying modifiers to these other types of words or terms to help us better understand like what laws should be in place, et cetera, right? And hopefully help us create different standards. So that was a terrible way of trying to say that. I've been trying to convince people that cannabis and hemp are better used now as a classification system based on a regulatory framework than they really are as a way of properly describing the names of these common products that we see in the marketplace.
I would argue that some of these hemp products are the regulators are not even on the field. Like, they're not even playing the game, right? So, in the legal marijuana market, I'm gonna say marijuana because cannabis includes both hemp and marijuana, they're 2 different things. So, in the legal marijuana market, it's incredibly regulated. They bag it and tag it from seed to sale. They have all these kinds of testing processes that have to be passed before that flower or product can be put on the shelf, the Cannabis Safety and Quality, and there are issues with that, but at least there are it's standards put in place that you have to pass before you can put that product on the shelf for a consumer to then smoke or eat. Hemp, on the other hand, right? If you're a legal hemp grower, you've got to adhere to a certain set of rules set by the USDA. And if you don't adhere to those standards, you may end up in jail and you have to destroy that product. But the USDA only regulates up until harvest, and then they don't care what you do with it, right? So all of that product from harvest to sale and anything that's done to that product in the meantime is not regulated, really. And then there's a whole 'nother thing going on right now where this THCA hemp is basically, as far as I can figure out, probably failed flower from the marijuana market that they're supposed to destroy, but really they just relabel it as THCA hemp, ship it out the back door, slap a label on it, put it on a shelf. So anything with the term hemp on it really is void of any of the regulatory barriers that make it more safe for a consumer to have trust that that product is not going to have any sort of negative effects in terms of safety and quality. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, so this is where it's, you are absolutely right. And there's a whole, we just missed the traditional edible seed marketplace, right? So if we just totally ignored cannabinoids and said that they truly didn't exist and it wasn't a problem in varieties of cannabis plants that can be regulatorily classified as hemp because of a limit of the cannabinoid established in the crop, right? But also in then it's an ag good, right? And all of that. And you're growing it to grow for seeds, right? And those seeds are for human food. Well,
Mhm.
then, like, those regulations are well established, right? Like you said, USDA controls all the ag crop while it's in the ground. And then I'm not 100% sure about seeds and nuts, whether that's FDA or USDA designation, right? Because, in our country, it's not all one group that handles something if humans eat it or not. It's confusing and conflated, right? So if it's USDA and it stays US right in the ground, but then the seeds are then also USDA, which I don't think is the case. I think, anyways,
If
then
it's seed that's
it
gonna go to crop production, then it stays USDA, but if it's seed that's gonna go for consumption, then it's a food, so I would think then it would be the FDA.
Right. The point being is that there are established federal regulations in place, right? That then the states have their own kind of ways of enforcing that, but well established rules for food crops and foods, right? And that's where the whole, like you said, the hemp starts to mean all of these various other things has confused situations on the ground because there should have been no reasons why regulatory authorities didn't make people who are growing within their markets for hemp apply to standard food codes for if they were just growing for seed for human use. Why would they not, for this crop, have to comply with 21 CFR 117 for human food, just like everyone else in their state who's producing human foods? There was kind of a
Mhm,
miss there, right?
mhm,
Just like we've had on the marijuana side. There was a miss that because this is new, this is scary, the cannabis plant, right? Reefer madness. We can't apply just common sense to this product when it comes to the safety and quality. We had to create new models, which doesn't make any sense. But a lot of states have started to correct that where you start to see new rules explicitly saying that hemp consumables have to follow food safety plans, some states requiring GMP certification or otherwise. And that's kind of where I think a lot of harm has happened to the marketplace by the conflation of different types of cannabinoid products, right? And their ability to be regulatorily classified as hemp, right? And
mhm,
the intent of trying to establish a hemp marketplace in the United States for growing food and fiber domestically, right? Because the United
mhm,
States is the global consumer of hemp seeds and fibers, but yet
mhm.
we don't produce any of it here, right? That's just crazy.
Right. Wow. And the infrastructure to do that has long since been gone
Long gone.
since the 30s, 40s, something like that. We had mills that could make the paper and the fiber products and it processed the seeds, but that's long since been gone and nobody's rebuilding. I don't know why, but I guess it's cheaper to outsource than to build. I mean, we got rid of our car industry too for them, and yeah. So, goodness, forgot what I was going to say. Oh, so one question. So I've noticed, and this used to be a pet peeve. Since I've been in the industry so long, I switch back and forth between cannabinoids, which I have always felt is a wrong way to say it because it's not cannabis, it's cannabis. So why isn't it cannabinoids rather than cannabinoids? Do you ever like, does you, because my brain goes, and I used to complain about it. And now my son is like, Mom, how come you're saying cannabinoids? I'm like, I say both all the time. Like, like it just depends what comes out of my mouth.
Great question. I guess I think it's a potato, aluminium thing.
No one says potato first. Number two, aluminum, aluminium are actually spelled differently. And there's a whole backstory behind that, which you may know, or but it's interesting because it was aluminum, like I can't even remember now, but then they changed it to aluminium, like plutonium, like the eons, and then the Americans changed it back to aluminum, which is the original describer's way that he wanted to spell it. So Americans are actually saying it correctly, and I'm Australian, so I say aluminium. Turns out I'm wrong, but I say banana now, whereas most say banana. Banana. So anyway, I just wondered if because you're definitely a cannabinoid person and yeah. Oh, so going back to okay, so back in the day when you started out in the cannabis industry and hemp was being grown in immense quantities in Colorado as well as a lot of other places, and all of this distillate was being produced, and at first, it was very expensive and very lucrative, but then when everybody started growing it, the market got saturated, the market tanked, the price tanked, and everybody was left with tons of CBD isolate, which is kind of what I feel was a large driver of turning CBD into something else that can sell, which is where we've got Delta 8 was the first one that popped up. People started making Delta 8, CBN. then Delta 10, then Delta 9 popped up, which was interesting to me because technically it's made from CBD, which made it hemp derived, which made it legal, but it's still Delta 9, which is what you get from THC type plants. And so when that happened, a lot of farmers, well, the rules changed from the USDA to make it more strict to grow. Like your THC had to be your total THC, not just Delta 9 THC, but your total THC was defined as it had to be below point 0.3, which made it very difficult for a lot of farmers to hit that because, especially in the warmer climates, there's a tendency for that THC to go over the that threshold. And so a lot of farmers have pulled out of growing CBD type flower. The consumers have not gone away, right? And there's probably even more people using CBD today than there were back in 2018. And so I feel like the pendulum is going to swing the other way, where the leftover farmers that are still growing CBD are going to be left holding a very valuable commodity that's not being produced in great quantities anymore, where the products are still needed and wanted by the consumers. So, how do you feel about that, since you have been in this looking in since, I'm guessing you're around 2012?
But yeah, so that was even before the Farm Bill, remember? Right? Like, so in that case, we effectively created the loophole that allowed you to import hemp and get cannabinoids from, in this case, CBD, right, from that hemp, and then call the thing we made from that hemp, which was much more of a way of skirting around things, right? Bending rules and whatnot. Obviously, when the Farm Bill was passed, there was an explicit intent, right? To allow flowers to be grown, flowers to be harvested, and extracts to be
Mhm.
made. So I guess your question was, there was a lot to it, but for the farmers, I don't see them coming back until there's planting seed they can rely on. Not
Mhm.
like the true commercial scale farmer, right? That's banking next year's crop, or sorry, next year's planting cycle on a guaranteed purchase amount for a guaranteed commodity value for a known yield they're expecting to get. That's how they work. They don't work on questions. They have knowns that they are expecting, and then they get crop insurance if the weather destroys that. But otherwise, no crop without the weather going bad. They have a expected yield that they're going to get, and they bank on it. So I don't see real farmers coming back for a long, long time until we get our act together with establishing a certified seed program for varietals, for seed, for fiber, for floral materials, right, etc. I do think those farmers who have been continuing to push their varietal types, right, they're gonna get closer to that, to maybe getting seeds out there that others could use on a repeated scale. But I would agree with you that the consumer is becoming more aware of types of cannabinoids that are now available to them, which is great. I would probably agree
Mm.
that once the current supply of CBD goes away, there will certainly be an influx of need for it based on a new, more well-established commodity value, because supply and demand will kind of figure itself out. Without this real clarification from the FDA coming soon and the dust settling by the end of this year related to what the FDA is going to say is not natural and also is a THC class, they're going to ban those and not allow them to come from types of cannabis plants that can be regulatorily classified as hemp, cannabinoid products that can be regulatorily classified as hemp, primarily because they're non-intoxicating and they have a total THC's content now, right? Below a certain threshold. So it's a way of
Well,
classifying those products.
I think kind of closing the gap where they're saying no more bathtub cannabinoids. Like if it's made in a lab, it's a non-starter. So
Out completely. Yeah.
yep. So we're not taking CBD, and then this will close up at the end of this year. So November 2026 is when they're saying that they're gonna finalize this language. So no more taking CBD and turning it into Delta 9 THC. Which is fine. We have a plant that makes THCA, which then turns into Delta 9 THC when you smoke it. So there's no reason for it to be turning CBD into something that we've already got a plant that does that. And I feel like, they need to address the farm bill. The farm bill is supposed to be revisited every 4 years, and they kind of haven't been doing that very well. They had interim rules because in 2018, people were like, "Oh, but it's Delta 9 up," and it's the same. It's the same argument that we're having now with the THCA Delta 9 problem. So then the USDA said, "Nope, it's total THC. It's got to be below 0.3% total THC." So that's what it is. I think that went into effect, those final rules went into effect in 2021. It's now 2026, and they haven't revisited it yet. They've kind of been kicking around some ideas, but they haven't really done anything to finalize or even propose any of the new language in their revisitation. But I'm real all of that, really a lot of words to say that I would love it if they would just raise the limit for total THC to 1%. That would bring back a lot of farmers because it would make it so much easier to grow. Point 0.3 is a ridiculously low number to hit, and you can't really bring your crop to full maturity, which, then it's I mean, you can just imagine that that's not a great model. So, I think raising the limit to 1 or even 2%, like, that's not gonna get people high, would give the farmers a lot more wiggle room to actually have a compliant crop, and we could get the farmers back because right now so many have left and gone back to doing beets or alfalfa or whatever they were doing before the green rush.
Yeah. But I mean, again, going back to, I guess, yes, it is true that getting something that's certified and established to always go below to test clean, right, or not hot, right, takes time. But it can be done. The Canadians and the European marketplaces are both evidence of certified seed programs that have resulted in compliant varietals that, you know, are functional for the purpose of growing seed and fiber. So I would certainly agree with you that increasing the THC content, because as we know, the two cannabinoids and all the various cannabinoids that result from CBGA, right, and the various synthases propagate more when you up the THC amount. When you allow more THC, you get more varieties of different cannabinoids in general. So if the intent is to create a mechanism to produce legal cannabinoid herbal source materials, right, that allow you to then harvest, extract, and refine cannabinoids, then that are then going to be regulatorily classified as hemp. All that is great. It's just kind of like, and I do agree with you that up to that 1% would certainly allow more variance and ease for those farmers intending to try to grow these types in field, right? The ability to stay in compliance. But I guess it still comes down to then you're growing for the flower, right? For the intent of harvesting cannabinoids. You're gonna be creating THC in some amounts, right? So you still have a challenge of dealing with what do you do with the excess THC that you create? As if you're the processor, the farmer, right, makes it much easier for them since they're just producing the raw material.
It is a complicated problem, and having 2 separate markets, really, I don't know, like, I kinda feel like it should be split up in usage group. Is it going to grain and fiber, or is it going for consumption? Because, with your passion of safety, the consumer safety, if it's going to consumption, it should be regulated throughout, right? We need to make sure that there's no molds and fungus and pesticides and heavy metals, and the hemp industry is not set up to do that. There aren't those requirements, although, if you've got a good ethical farmer who is growing for CBD and knows that that's going to consumption, they do the full panel tests for that. But what are your thoughts on that?
I do agree that usage is the better way for us to approach licensing structure for growing this crop, right? A tiered licensing system based on what you're growing it for makes tons of sense. I can see 4 levels of licensing. I've actually kind of thought about this a little bit, but your lowest one, right, is you just grow for fiber. Because if you harvest before 150 days, for instance, and maybe that's where we could create supporting standards to provide practices for farmers so that they can see that, hey, if you grow for fiber and you harvest before 150 days, right? No flowers or minimal flower amount has been produced at that point, right? In that stage of the crop's life cycle. And therefore, we've eliminated the risk of cannabinoid contamination in the field. And therefore, no testing for cannabinoids in the field are required whatsoever for for the stalks, right? For the stalk that's in the field or for the retted straw bales that result from there, right? Because they just grew for stock. They harvested before 150 days. They used a retting process, field, winter, otherwise, stream, doesn't matter. Some enzymatic process, right, to digest everything on the outside, which has been shown to again just destroy cannabinoids, right? So again, no field testing whatsoever. Easy peasy straw bales out of the field, right? Fiber away we
Mhm.
go. Next level up
Yeah.
would
Nobody.
be
Yeah.
you grow for seed, right? Is next level up. That's because, flowers have to produce, right? In order to grow seed, right? You got to have flowers, which means there's
Hmm.
going to be resins. So now
Hmm.
maybe we just arm farmers with practices for helping to clean that seed so that maybe you
Hmm.
do two consecutive cleaning cycles, right, to sort the seed and remove debris and stuff like that. And that's enough to now remove all surface contamination. Again, we show that with some standards, right? Bam, no testing at the farm gate for seed. And now those two commodities, right, can just away you go. But we didn't say anything about hemp or cannabis or marijuana. We didn't say anything about cannabinoid content, right? Because it doesn't matter. Not growing for those things. And then the other two levels, obviously, if you start to grow for floral material and those cannabinoids are non intoxicating, there's minimal risk, right, to public health. So away you go. And then that fourth one, super high level risk, right? Again, you're now growing for intoxicating cannabinoids, higher risk. So, more restrictions in the field. Now things start to get more complicated. So I agree with that. Again, another long winded way of saying I absolutely agree with you. Usage is a smarter way to do it. We can combine not only what are you
Hmm.
growing it for, but what are some modern assessments, right, of the risk of those things you're growing for? If you're growing for the floral material, right, we know very clearly there's less risk
Hmm.
from cannabinoids that are non intoxicating. So let's reduce those pressures. What the market has so
Hmm.
far come at this from philosophically is that let's just say, like, those three tiers below the level four intoxicating, right? Everybody calls these things hemp, and this vilified thing over here with the intoxicating cannabinoids becomes marijuana or cannabis or whatever. And that's where I think
Could call it. We could call it floral cannabis. We could call it grain cannabis, and we could call it fiber cannabis. Right. Get rid of this hemp business altogether
we
because it's all cannabis.
unfortunately, yeah, science wise, it's all cannabis, right? But then you have two very strong and well established regulatory concepts that are also marijuana and cannabis and hemp. And these two very different regulatory frameworks and concepts do exist. And therefore, we need to be able to allow these various awesome things and parts that come from a cannabis plant, right? Singularly, to then fit into those regulatory structures that we are stuck with, right? Until we can evolve past them. But that's what we've got right now. So if it means
Look,
that, yeah, I apologize. Go ahead.
that's okay. So you say that I say it's all cannabis. So get rid of this hemp thing. But and then you said, but for science, it's all one thing. But we've got these two things. But I've had to recently had this conversation that actually hemp for, fiber and grain, and then marijuana actually separate out really well genetically because we've been selecting them so many thousands of years. There is now a genetic divergence among the two usage groups, right? So there could even be not only a chemotype test, but there could be a genetic test because fiber and grain is going to separate out into the hemp type category whereas a lot of the floral cannabis is going to separate into the plants that were bred to create cannabinoids, right? Or cannabinoids.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, that's another great way to approach it. And if there were genotypic markers, which I know is your bread and butter that you're doing now, where we could truly identify a seed type and a fiber type from a floral type. Now we're talking about blowing people's minds.
Would that blow people's minds?
I think they would, because right now, how do we classify types of cannabis, right? We've got one, two, three, four, presumably, and that's on the dominant of the cannabinoid that's produced in the type, right? And maybe potentially
There's
up,
5.
depending on how you kind of want to arguably delineate. Does that mean that in that system, one of the types would be like a sixth and seventh would be seed and fiber type? Or would we just have three and then the floral type could then be split into what we are traditionally calling the type ones through four, et cetera?
So for the viewers, clarification, type 1 is THC dominant, type 2 is CBD THC balanced, type 3 is CBD dominant, type 4 is CBG dominant, type 5 is void of all cannabinoids, which I've only ever seen one sort of research paper that used that. It was an insect paper to see if insects prefer cannabinoids or not. But then we're missing, we could be missing the fiber and grain because they're not really we're not growing them for cannabinoids. So where would they fit into that? Which you made a good point. But then also up and coming, we've got THCV dominant cannabis, which is probably going to be followed not too far behind with CBDV dominant potentially. And we know that there's a CBC synthase, right? CBCA synthase. So where are all the CBC dominant plants? That's been a conversation I've been having, and it seems to be that cannabis doesn't really like making CBC that much, so it just doesn't. But if you knocked out the other 2 pathways, using genetic engineering or something like that, potentially you could force it to make CBC. So I think that those 5 categories are lacking. Do we have 3? Do we have 4? Do we have 5? Do we have more? And where does everything fit? As we learn more and as we select, I think that we're gonna need some more categories. And people love to categorize things.
So I would argue that most people have been growing the type 3 knoll varieties or type 3s, 4s, and 5s, mostly for seed and fiber because we put upon ourselves an arbitrary acknowledgement within the UN single conventions that resins were scary and bad, the tops were scary and bad, right? So we started creating these mechanisms in regulation for delineation, right? But before then,
Mm,
we didn't have any of that, right? People just grew
right.
for fiber or seed mostly, right?
Mhm.
But at the same time, as consequence, they were harvesting tops. They were getting resins, right, all over their hands. And that's how we were getting hashish and traditional forms, right? Some cultures did smoke the flowers, but really it was an effort to get to the seeds is how we ended up with some resins, right? To have fun with.
Ah.
Yeah, right. And roll it off, and then you throw some of the stuff in the fire because you needed to stay warm, and then, things would happen, and you put 2 and 2 together over time, right? But
Yeah.
so where I was going with that is growing for fiber is a technique in agronomics. It's a certain planting density, and that
Mhm.
produces, I would argue, because there's no data on the contrary from any type of cannabis that's out there, as we would designate it based on the traditional type system, could be grown forcibly through agronomics to produce good fiber, fiber for spinning specifically, in the respect of producing the bast fibers that are good for spinning. Hemp people will not like it if you say that, because then that would mean you could grow THC for fiber. But we all know there's the devil's lettuce is for absolutely zero use other than getting high. Who's to say the most nutritional seed doesn't come from type 1 for
Right.
eating? Where's that study to say That's not the case, and it has to be type 3 or otherwise to produce nutritional seed of nutritional value for humans or animals. Where is that study?
Well, I mean, does it really matter? I mean, when you're growing for seed, right, you're gonna
It
have males
matters.
around. They're going to pollinate the female flowers. Once those female flowers are pollinated and they start growing their seed, they're not gonna put any effort into getting any bigger and stagger. Like, the cannabinoid production stops because their job is done. Their whole purpose in life is to make a seed, and so when they get pregnant, when they start making a seed, they're done. With fiber too, I'm not gonna put 100% on this, but I'm pretty sure that there have been studies done that show that the male plants produce better fibers, stronger fibers than the female plants. So if you've got a field full of male and female plants, they're all gonna be seeded and not really good for resin production either.
Well, so there's certainly, I would say, diversions of opinion about whether or not the cannabis plant is truly a singular crop plant or if it can be multi-crop. Those who are really into spinnable fiber, right? What you really need for something that's spinnable is a stalk that's really about the size of a pencil or about a pen. And this size
And
all the way up. That's what you want.
Mhm,
And you want to have minimal shooting, right? Side branching. And in order to do that, you plant very, very tight, right? The planted density of that is super intense. The other thing you want to make sure is that you
mhm,
haven't had the lumen fully close because that means your stalks are very old and you want to have as much fast fiber production as possible and less hurd. So the older the stalk is, the more hurd you have, and the more that ends up turning the stalk into a woody structure, right? Which is great if you want to make paper, maybe you want to make hemp lime, any of those things we want to do for constructions and insulation materials. But anyway, anything you want to do with the woody bits, having older, larger, huge, massive stalks is good for that. But if you want good spinnable fiber, younger, skinnier stalks that have produced less
mhm.
fast is what you want. So really, you don't want to let your fiber crop go past, that's what I mentioned earlier, past 150 days if you want to be spinning your fiber and make clothes. And which is the absolute hardest thing we can possibly do from natural fibers is spin them to make clothes. But if you want to do that, growing your crop past
Yeah.
150 days means you're now de-optimizing your crop for fiber.
'Cause there are different types of fiber that we're talking about. It's not just you grow one plant to make all fiber. You want it to be soft, right? You don't want itchy, scratchy, big fibers that is gonna be uncomfortable to wear. We've got canvas, right? Which needs to be strong. We've got rope, which needs to have strong, unbroken fibers. You wouldn't be able to really make clothing fiber into a strong rope. And then we've got building. Right? So hempcrete or making the hemp fibers into a composite wood that can then be used for flooring, countertops, cabinets, that sort of thing. So there's like all these different kinds of fibers that could come from really any type of plant, young, old, depending on what you want that fiber to go to. If you're growing the really, really, really tall, like 10-foot plants with the big long stalk, that's going to be ideal for rope and the ones, yeah. So there's different types of fiber.
Yes. Just one point of correction though, to make your fiber soft and all it's typically not a property of the crop itself, though it certainly could be one that could be bred into it over time and produced. Creating a really nice, soft, spinnable fiber is a result of a combination of both wet and dry processing that can be fairly aggressive to make natural fibers actually feel soft.
Glad you were talking about before, like digestive enzymes and things that are going to get rid of all of the crunch.
Well, you start all of this in the field, right? And so the retting process is a natural enzymatic process where just leaving your stock out in the field to literally rot eats away the really tough lignin bits between all the fibers for you so that you can then get dried straw, basically, can bale it up, can store that, and then ship it to decorticating facilities, which really are just big breaking systems that will crack those bales open, send the straws through, and usually through a series of hammers or otherwise, will then explode those, right, and extract physically different types of fibers, as you mentioned. But for simplistic purposes, right, you have bast fibers and you have hurd, right, which is the woodier, chunkier bits that people use for hemp lime, hempcrete, and particle board, stuff like that. And you can turn into pulping for paper. And then the bast fibers are used for insulation, right? So like roll or bat insulation is what you would use these natural fibers for in a less processed form, and then you would continue to
Mhm.
process them and add chemicals to soften them, bleach them, make them potentially as short as cotton so that then you can spin it on cotton mills, since that's what we have to use to spin things
Gotcha.
in the
That's
US anyway.
yeah. So thanks for all of that information. Super interesting. And there's
So
not a lot of fiber growers, right? Everybody's sort of into this, what you were saying, the multi-purpose crop where you can get fiber and grain and maybe send some for extraction. We should talk about extraction too, because I know that, you
yeah,
know, you got some
well,
expertise
we
in that.
shouldn't fool ourselves in the US. We are only growing hemp for cannabinoids. There
Hmm.
are a few real producers out there who are diehard growing for seed and fiber, but like you said, they are not well supported by infrastructure, right? To get the big seed cleaning infrastructure to really move all of that out and make sure the seeds are good and then into a silo for storage before they go to a seed pressing group, right? A co-man to go press all of your seed to make them whatever. Like that infrastructure is more there for seeds than it is for anything else. Fiber production, it's very difficult if there isn't a facility, a decorticating facility able to process your stock within 150 kilometers. And I know in the United States that hard to work with the metric system, right? But that's how close within a radius you have to be to a processing facility before shipping your stock to them now costs you more than your crop is worth. And
Oh,
so there's a lot to the
that,
economics of this that impacts why people haven't really gone hard into fiber.
that makes a lot of sense. And the United States is such a gigantic country. Like, people don't really grasp the concept of how huge the United States is. And so that distance that you mentioned is a super important piece of that puzzle. So if you're wanting to become a fiber grower, the chances of you having some sort of processing facility is not good.
So that's where co-ops become a big thing for that, right? Where you can have a bunch of farmers around each other and you invest in a decorticating facility so that you can get
Mhm.
your straw bales into now at least raw fibers of various grades of whatever, so you can get them now out to people who will then process them from there into whatever they're going to use them for.
Well, this conversation about hemp has been incredibly invigorating, but I really want to. No, no, it's been awesome. But I really, there's like two other things that I just really feel like we would be. I would be remiss if I didn't address these with you because it's your passions and your past and your expertise. Like, okay, let's talk about extractions. I know that you have extensive experience in extractions, and I am not sure, but maybe even developed some new methods for extractions. And I know you love talking about trichomes too. So let's like get into extractions and trichomes.
My passion has certainly, I fell in love with trichomes. I think they are amazing macroscopic structures that grow on the surface of the plant, almost like a whole other form with its own life cycle, right? And if you are a consumer of hash, especially traditional hashish or bubble hash or water hash, or just isolated individual trichome heads, understanding more about how the trichome grows allows you to produce better hash, better solventless products. And that's always been the main thing that's drove me to my passion in cannabis has been my love of hash and the trichomes there. So I used to start in very beginning was a diehard or advocate for CO2 within our industry. And that's because of CO2's known and proven selectability and manipulation using co-solvents, but just CO2 alone and using selective parameters can isolate different individual cannabinoids from varieties of cannabis. And you can even use it to de-wax, right? Typical parameters. The tools for CO2 extraction were more or less just complicated hydrocarbon systems, right? It's closed loop, high pressure, dealing with anywhere between 2 to 10,000 psi. It's hard to convince people that CO2 was the way to keep going, especially when you're competing in a marketplace for making concentrates, or if you're just trying to bang out a whole bunch of edibles. It starts to be a lot more efficient to use hydrocarbon to quickly produce concentrates, or ethanol, right, to just make a whole bunch of crude and distill that up into something that you can use as an ingredient, right? And that really over time has
Mhm.
kind of what it's come down to is how much budget do people have and how much cleanup work did they really want to do? And did they have a real scientist to use a real CO2 extractor? Which A, there weren't very many real CO2 extractors on the market to use, and even fewer real technicians, right, who didn't want a very high salary that would knew how to use those and selectively isolate and create, commercial scale extractions using CO2. I was an advocate for that, but then, I've really figured out that only people wanted to do is make smokable or ingestible concentrates. So ethanol really started becoming the king there because all you still had the de-wax CO2. So you're still introducing ethanol, which didn't make much sense to have to do a whole other ethanol step when you could just use ethanol to extract in the first place. So then it's really transition in facility design, right? And making sure you can work within a flammable system and still produce high quality extracts. Yeah. So, but my favorite thing is solventless. And I'm super excited to see that over time, we've seen not only the resurgence of solventless as a viable product in the marketplace, that technologies that are allowing it to actually compete even more so now with ethanol and hydrocarbon based systems on the commercial scale to produce good product. I was rambling. I
So,
apologize, Anna. I, I do.
I'm gonna try to edit some of this with AI because I live in New Jersey and my internet connection is constantly unstable. So I'm gonna try and do some AI magic on this episode. I'll try to make it as good as I can. But I was wondering, I also am a fan of solventless extractions, but I like the solvent methods are more economical. There is like you can your CO2 or your ethanol, right, which makes it so you can reuse it. It makes it a little more economical, but, like, you is one better than the other in terms of, how much money you're gonna need to spend on it and then recouping, and then I don't know if I'm answering or, even asking the question very well.
At a small scale, like US scale operator who's not hemp, right, and is in the marijuana space, ethanol all the way in comparison to CO2 or hydrocarbon because of it is a less costly expenditure to get it set up and quicker to recoup.
Mm.
CO2 is simply just a very expensive paperweight, unfortunately, at the smaller scales of operation. If you're like a ton scale operation, CO2 makes a lot of sense because you don't want to be using so much solvent, right? That becomes a safety hazard all on its own. You just have so much quantity, capacity of a flammable solvent, right? But on the small scale, it's too slow. And you still then have to enter a solvent to do winterization. Again, unless you have a very sophisticated piece of equipment, which again makes it even more expensive, and someone who knows how to use it. And hydrocarbon on the other side is all C1D1. Everything is even more expensive now to set up infrastructure wise for your facility or more constraints on the availability of hydrocarbon gas so that it keeps going up, right? So ethanol by far is the cheaper install and the faster recoup of your investment, but it does limit your formats
So now
of, of what you can make, right?
yeah. So the hydrocarbon price and limits. Is that because of the danger aspect of it? It, is explosive and flammable and everything else? Yeah.
So it's both, right? So it's both your infrastructure for your facilities is much more expensive, having to be all C1D1 related to the flammability hazard being so high. Like even your cameras, even your locking mechanisms, right? Everything. So it makes things much more expensive there. The equipment, the extractor itself then becomes more expensive because of the safety systems there. Maintenance is not much more than the other systems, but certainly should be a higher priority because if you lax on maintenance, that could be not only facility damage, that could be a dead employee or a severely injured
Yeah.
employee. So there's risks and liability and insurance that's also come in that's more in respect to the hydrocarbon side, things you don't necessarily
Mm,
start to think about. And then there's just the gas itself that is not a renewable resource and only continues to increase in price over time.
gotcha. That makes sense. Okay, so I guess if that's all you want to say about trichomes and extractions, then
Well, I think there should be a lot more fun work done in macroscopic analysis of trichomes. I've seen a lot of really cool research lately, right, to help identify washers and through genetic analysis. So maybe Anna, your group can dive into that in like what genes express multiglandular heads. So like I've seen like two
mm,
with good evidence that they probably both grew, but then more than 2, like, I have a great picture of one that has 4, but did they fall onto it and
mhm,
stick, or did they all grow, right, from one singular vascular system? And if you could figure out the genes, right, that could grow larger heads and multiple heads, now I think you've really started creating some intrinsic value for people who are on the hunt for new genetics, right? And new varieties, because you can now really produce true washing types of classic strains, for instance, or things like that, through hopefully maybe less aggressive genetic manipulation and just some maybe smart tweakings, and you could have a type produce more and larger glandular trichomes, which would be great. And I guess in that note, connecting, you've seen some beautiful photos, I'm sure, online recently, right, of some great macroscopic photography. Mixing, I think, combining that with really powerful digital microscopy where you can actually measure your trichomes, you can calculate the density without having to physically count them. You can have a computer program do it. As we start to see that more it get actually used by our licensed operators, we're going to start to see some really exciting things happen and more hopefully really interesting research projects related to just trichomes.
yeah, and I think we talked about this over dinner at the conference, was this multi-headed trichome sort of in figuring out genes. It could be just that they're mutants, right? And I don't know, you're right, we don't look at the macroscopic level, very often, and to find somebody who is skilled at macroscopy, there's not that many of them out there, and a lot of them are photographers, right? And so, as scientists, getting down and dirty with the microscope and figuring out, like, should we be looking at it? And if so, is it at the genetic level where there are genes that are expressing that type of multi-headed trichome, or is it a mutation? And if so, could we start selecting for different kinds of trichomes and trichome density? It doesn't necessarily have to be genetic manipulation. It could just be a different focus of what we are selecting for, because like, we can select for something that's more potent, or we can look at the COA, but we could definitely look at the actual characteristics of different kinds of plants and what other trichomes look like. Because I don't know anybody who really pays close attention to their phenotypes. It's like, y we can take out a jeweler's loop and look at them, but really, what are we looking at in terms of what you're talking about? Because it seems like they're more rare than common.
The washers out there, going back to that term originally, right, are certainly paying attention to which types of trichomes, how many trichomes, at least in the respect of like, are they larger or smaller heads and the density of them in the field of view. I know there are definitely groups that are at least tracking some of this data. And when we really start paying attention to it is when we're going to start to see more fascinating research and studies coming out of what we can do with cannabis and their trichomes. Like
Mhm.
they autofluoresce. And so can we use that during size exclusion and separation, right? To then not only separate them by size, but can then we shine a UV light on them and go, oh, they're fluorescing differently. Can we now use a fancy robot arm to then select the ones of different colors and different sizes to then solventlessly, selectively isolate, I guess, phytochemical profile?
But I think that your thought process around trichomes is fascinating, and just thinking about that as a whole nother branch of what scientists and researchers can get into, cultivators as well, is interesting to think about. And so I guess, the last thing that is DSQ, dun, dun, because I have talked to you about this before. It's an accreditation, what do I want to say, like organization, right? I'm not going to pretend to know what it is, but I do want you to talk about it because it's really interesting what you're doing, and you do workshops and things like that. So give me your spiel on the CSQ.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for the opportunity to talk about cannabis safety and quality, CSQ. We are the only accredited CGMP conformant safety and quality management certification program for licensed cannabis or hemp operators producing cannabinoid products. So if you make a cannabinoid product, we've been talking about these, if you grow an herbal material, make a substance, or make a product, whether it's inhalable, ingestible, topical, we have a product safety certification program that is tailored for you. And it covers from seed to sale every piece of the global supply chain. So there are a lot of GMP certifications or programs out there, and ours is the only one that is accredited. Accreditation to a certification program is an extra level of scrutiny where we are assessed by the American National Standards Institute's accreditation board. ANAB comes in and accredits our certification program to ISO 17065. And then our certification program is audited and certified by licensed, accredited certification bodies. So not just anyone can provide you with a CSQ certification. They have to be licensed by us as well as assessed by our accreditation body to perform accredited certifications to CSQ. All of that is really saying that we have built in a robust integrity program within our system that provides a set of accountability, not only for the license operator, but on us in maintaining our program in order to represent a robust safety and quality system. And really, it's there to help or to allow license operators, whether you're a grower, an extractor, product manufacturer, a distributor, or a warehouse, or a retailer, an ability to show that they take product safety and quality seriously and really want to wear a badge of honor. Because I'm sure, as you know, in many markets within the United States, unfortunately, implementing GMPs isn't required, though they might have some type of safety and quality regulations in place. Even fewer states, only two, actually require you to get certified by a third party to show that you're producing safe and quality product. That license operator is taking upon themselves to show that, they're above everybody else because they've let someone come in and poke around when people usually don't like people poking around and shine flashlights in dark corners and come in and audit them and say through an inspection that, yeah, they actually produce safe and quality product. So we're helping to basically give consumers and regulators in the marketplace in general, right, a way that you can find good actors and trust that those products are safe to consume.
Okay, so cultivators in the marijuana space, I mean, in crops, you would get something like organic certification to show that you're only producing things organically, or you would have GAP certification, good agricultural practices certification. In marijuana, they don't have that, right? Because it's the a bad industry and everybody's crooks and we're all doing illegal things, right? You can get organically certified and you can get GAP certified, but it's my understanding that in marijuana you cannot. So does this button up sort of that
Gap?
potentially? Yeah.
It does, yes. So our CSQ cultivation program is fully conformant with current good agricultural and collection practices and current good manufacturing practices. We make a hard line at harvest for
Mhm.
indoor and greenhouse operations that once you start to bring it down and process the crop, you are now into manufacturing. Whereas for outdoor, the line is more of once you bring that crop inside, right, out of the field, it's now into manufacturing.
Okay, so it goes this cultivation first is well, yeah, from if we go from seed to sale, cultivation certification first is and through CSQ, then it would be manufacturing. Then I'm
Well,
presuming production?
so actually extraction, so cultivation, then extraction, then manufacturing. So you got to get to your extracts first. So we kind of call our extractors in this case like ingredient manufacturers. Like so if you're going to make bulk sugar for someone who's going to buy, 50-pound bags for making brownies or whatever, right? Or buy it at a restaurant in bulk, right? Your sugar producer is would be your CSQ extraction basically. So if you're making bulk concentrates, or breaking those concentrates down into individual grams, that's CSQ extraction's the program for you. But if you're going to take those extracts or any plant material and package them as flour or concentrates or create vape cartridges or topical formulations or edibles, that's where CSQ manufacturing comes in.
Manufacturing. Right. Okay. And then is it the final one, it would be the dispensary?
Yeah, and we also have warehousing and distribution in between,
Oh.
because if you're gonna put your, say,
That
million
must be
dollar batch of rosin, you certainly want to make sure that they're taking your product safety and quality seriously during what in the time that they've taken possession of it and are taking it to the retailer. And then yes, we've got retail at the end there to make sure that when you're handling them at the point of sale, that you're doing that in a safe and quality manner. And we also cover in the markets that allow it, deli style operators to give them an extra level of safety and quality, when they are handling raw or exposed material at the point of sale.
are they still doing deli style in Colorado?
We sure
Yes.
are.
And then what other states do deli style? Because I don't think there's that many, right? Most of them are
No,
like
it's not
packaged.
that many. I know for sure Colorado and Missouri because we have teams in both, right? Our headquarters is in Missouri, and then myself are here in Colorado, along with my communications director. So we know for sure that in those markets, deli style definitely still reigns. Our program would provide better safety and quality for those states that do allow it. And if other states want to maybe relook at it, right? And allow deli style in the future, there's a way to
Mhm.
maintain the safety and quality of those products.
Anybody who has a cannabis business that wants to take a step above and beyond the rest can go through this cannabis safety and quality process, get certified by an accredited you guys to
Right.
say that they pass all of these safety and quality standards that you have set in place to ensure that people are running a tight ship and
That's
not
correct. And so if you're in a state like Florida, it's required, as well as a state like New York, it's also required. But in other markets where it's not required, it's more of that badge of honor. But it's for whether you're cannabis, marijuana, or hemp. If you put cannabinoids in a product, Cannabis Safety and
Mhm.
Quality is a certification program for you, which is relevant for really anyone who's thinking about going under a hemp licensing framework, making CBD, right? Cannabinoid products and selling those into a marketplace. A CSQ certification is really the most appropriate certification for you. You may try or hope that you can use a standard food safety certification or a GFSI scheme, Global Food Safety Initiative. Schemes under that program are like SQF, FFSC 22000. You might be familiar with these, Anna, or not. Not these are all food safety systems. Then you've got BRC. You also have IFC. They're all like International Food Code. The British one is BRC. But anyway, these are all various different groups like CSQ that create standards that you can get certified to. And they're all specifically related to food safety, right? So in the United States, hemp is food, right? But cannabinoids, the FDA has said, are not food yet. We'll see what they say, right? There still isn't really any clarification how they're going to address the now cannabinoid products that they're going to allow through hemp regulatory frameworks and how they're going to address them. Currently, they're not foods and they're not allowed in products. CSQ is the only accredited safety and quality management certification program that includes cannabinoids within its scope. All things like
Nope.
SQF and others don't include the actual cannabinoids in their scope. They may include hemp seeds, hemp seed oil, and stuff like that, because those are foods ingredients, things they're very familiar with. But as soon as you want
Mhm.
to claim the cannabinoid content on the product, it's now not hemp, it's an adulterated food, got these things in it, right? Gets put into squishy land. And any major co-manufacturer isn't going to jeopardize the legality of their business, right? When they may do, $1 million with Pepsi or otherwise, or other various established food entities under their established food safety programs, right? They don't want to jeopardize that by now including cannabinoids within their program. So CSQ gives really any hemp operator looking to access mainstream marketplaces an accredited safety and quality management certification program that will stand up to the due diligence assessment or a second party audit from, like a Target or a Walmart or a Kroger or various other big box retailers, which is where we want to be when it comes to making these fun products or these great products.
So, obviously, you've got your QR code there that people can get in contact with CSQ. Is it being well received by the cannabis community to have this sort of certification and accreditation? Is it being well received? Are people really biting on this, or are people still being cagey, the cannabis industry?
I would say we have good traction. I don't have the data from our competitors. There are other unaccredited certification programs out there, which might be attractive to people because they're cheaper,
Mhm,
faster. But we do have over 120
mhm.
certified licensed operators around the country, which you can find in our public database on our website. All of our information is actually publicly available. All of our resources and our standards are free and can be downloaded from the website. New York and Florida, we're one of the required programs. So in those states where it's required, we're doing very well. We want to see, obviously, other states and operators take consumer safety and product quality more seriously, and we're starting to see it. Ohio, right, just mandated GMPs, and the state's going to start doing inspections to make sure you've implemented those. So that's a big deal. Alabama just mandated GMPs for hemp cannabinoid producers. These are new requirements that are in place. States are getting it, right? They're coming online one at a time. So it really is more of a being proactive now, right? Thinking about it, being aware of it is the best risk mitigation strategy any licensed operator, whether you're on cannabis or the hemp side, can do right now to ensure longevity of their business.
Really happy to hear that more states are coming on board and that people are taking it upon themselves to make sure that, consumer safety ahead of what is the bare minimum to put the product on the shelf. I would love to get your take on two conversations that are also dominating the socials are irradiation post failure, not as a protective measure that they just sort of do, but like you get your batch of flour back, it's failed, molds, yeasts, whatever, irradiate it, now it can pass. And the conversation around pesticides, we know that cultivators are going, "Oh, this one's not on the list. We'll use that one because it's not gonna be tested for it." Can you speak about that and how that fits into your CSQ?
Yeah, sure. So I guess pesticides and sorry, what was the other one? Oh,
Irradiation
yeah,
or
yeah, yeah, right. So that one's probably
remediation?
easier. The radiation's a little bit easier to probably touch first. Like you were kind of alluding to, if it's in process and you're using it as a control, a preventative, a kill step, right? Then it's preventative because say for instance you're in a market like Canada and your microbe limits are so tight that if you don't do it, there's a high chance that you wouldn't pass it because they're just crazy tight. So, the
Mhm.
most flour sold in Canada as a consequence is already right before it goes out as a kill step to ensure it passes, right? So, and that in my mind, just like
Before
with
it
any
even
other
gets
food,
tested.
which is typically done for many types of foods and other ingredients, etc., it's built into the process. Then it's a kill step. You're using it as a control measure. If the product though is going and it's failing, that means now fundamentally you're reworking it in some way to now bring it into compliance. That I've argued
Mhm.
a few times that our industry is still nascent enough and still burgeoning, still growing that we really need flexibility to be able to fix problems. There should certainly be boundaries established to that. Like, should you be allowed to remediate visibly moldy stuff? Absolutely not. That shouldn't have even gone to testing. You should have just thrown that away. It's gone. You shouldn't even extract it because you're going to concentrate all those things. Like, if it's visible, it's far too gone. There should be certainly
Right.
constraints put upon this. Pre-rolls, I think, is the best example because it's a lot like ground beef in the respect that when you grind it up, you increase the surface area. There's a lot of different batches of different beef being mixed into this to make your batch of ground beef. So it might not have been flour A, it could have been flour B that was actually contaminated. That's now made your input to your pre-rolls bad. I think there's an opportunity to help salvage batches like that through remediation, through irradiation or any type of mechanism to bring that back down into control at this point in our industry stage because people are hard enough in being able to make money, right? But there should be limits to that. Now, for the
Mhm.
pesticide side, that's really tricky because, yeah, we don't know what we don't know with regards to, and you could argue that if you're going to smoke anything, you shouldn't be putting any pesticides on it, right? Unless you've done the toxicological based risk assessment on those chemicals and you have the concentration limit actually established for that route of administration, which, we're not really treating pesticides like that. So I guess that kind of comes fundamentally down to if you're going to grow it for inhalation, should you be able to use any pesticides at all?
Well, not in inhalation though, even if you're gonna put it into an edible, right? Because ingesting pesticides is not a good idea either. And a lot of the
Agreed.
produce we eat gets washed or processed before it comes to us, or we can watch it at home. The thing about cannabis flower in particular is that it's not that easy to wash.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, especially when it's dried, it can be brittle, right? And then it's just going to fall apart on you. You're
yep,
absolutely right. So, really, it comes down to we need better data to establish pesticide concentration limits for inhalation on dried flower, right? I mean, it's also not safe for ingestion. There are different limits for every route of administration. You need to make sure whatever it is when it's in that ingestible that it meets those limits. So, I
it's
guess
such a it
it's a complicated one.
it is because, we could even say like, "Okay, just no pesticides. You're not allowed to use them." But this is a commodity, this is a product, this is a business if people are gonna apply pesticides. So we come up with a list of pesticides that are the most dangerous. Okay, this pesticide is not on the list, so I'm gonna use that. And I just don't think that there's any reasonable solution to this problem because a lab cannot possibly test for all of the pesticides that are out there. There are hundreds, maybe even thousands of pesticides like, you can access them online. Like, there are so many, and no lab is gonna be able to have that on any panel of pest for without going broke, you
Absolutely,
know?
agreed. So it's like, because so if you said no pesticides, right? That's the scenario you just said. That means the lab has to now is way overburdened with having to test for every single possible pesticide, which to your point, I believe is thousands that they would need to be testing for, right? And that's just not economically feasible. So inevitably, that means we create a list, which I
Mhm.
guess means that then this will always need to be updated, right? As people are skirting around the edges. So really, I guess it ends up being you test it for the known things and you're going to see an unknown peak. And then you have to go through the characterization now to figure out what that unknown peak was, which will also be costly.
Right, and then you add another pesticide, and then they use a different one, and then the list gets so long again, we're back to square one where you can't test for everything.
So it's almost like we need like a federal agency that has the authority and budget to be continuously updating lists of pesticides that are approved for use in on cannabis crops. Almost like an environmental protection agency.
Right. I am of the opinion that we would do very well to have something like the health inspectors, right? That show up to your restaurant whenever they feel fit. It's a surprise visit. You are expected to have your, chicken on the bottom shelf in the walk-in. Your stuff on the make line needs to be at temperature. Your soup is at temperature. Your salad, like they go through they need to see employees washing their hands. They need to test the sanitizer in the dish sink. They just come in whenever and you can't like I don't know if you've ever worked in a restaurant, but when the health inspector comes in, it's like, "Oh shit, the health inspector's here." And you've got people running around, like, quickly trying to date stuff, like, you can't beat the health inspector. The health inspector knows what you're doing if you're, trying to catch up on your dates or if you're switching out the sanitizer. They see all of that, and you get marked. I don't know if they'll shut you down. I do think that the cannabis industry would do well to have something like that where they get pop-in inspections because you wouldn't be able to eliminate any trace of you using pesticides. If somebody just pops in, there's gonna be, a container of this, a container of that, a residue on the flower, whatever. But there's so many places that kind of inspection could be helpful, I think, in safety for cannabis.
100%. I just wish our states had larger budgets to be able to afford to do that.
Yeah. The regulate already you're not regulating very well.
The enforcement side is really the issue with all of this, right? Is that they're not enforcing the rules for labs, so we have lab shopping, and they're not enforcing the rules they have related to like a lot of states do require GMPs. Connecticut's a great example. To be a producer in Connecticut, you have to comply with 21 CFR 210 for the production of pharmaceutical drugs. That's like crazy GMPs. No one in Connecticut is at pharmaceutical GMP level production. And none of their administrators, the regulators, are trained in those assessments and those audits to know if they're meeting that requirement, right? So that's just a huge
Mhm.
gap in what we wrote in paper and what, or on into the law, right? And what we can actually do with the budgets people were given and the resources.
Yeah, it's more like a wish list than a playbook.
Well, and then that's where back to CSQ, if now there's so much mistrust, right? Consumers don't know who to trust, the operators don't know who to trust. Regulators certainly are now like, well, I just can't trust the labs or my operators anymore, right? Well, how do you know who's a good actor, who you can trust? A CSQ certification. That's one way, but there are obviously
Mhm.
other certifications that are out there, right? And that shows you who cares, who went above and beyond. And so more people looking
Yeah.
for these certifications, right? You're going to start to see operators hopefully realizing that that's the way they can not only protect themselves within the marketplace, they can differentiate themselves in these marketplaces where everyone now lacks trust in what was supposed to be what was establishing the trust, which is the testing and the regulators, et cetera.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, so, well, Darwin, couple of last things. First of all, is there anything else that you wanna talk about, or do you have any questions for me? And then the last thing is I'm gonna ask you, like, where can people find I mean, there's a QR code right there, so it probably isn't too hard to find you, but yeah, so last thing is there anything else you wanna talk about and anything you wanna ask me?
Well, I'm good on talking a bunch more. Like, I think I've covered things sufficiently, but I'd love to know what you're doing right now, Anna. What genetic projects you're working on, or if that's not, or if this is what you're doing now, or whatever.
Well, I'm still teaching basic and advanced cannabis science at the University of Colorado at Boulder online, so anybody can take those courses. I am still in the process of launching a startup, which is geared towards genetic identification, verification, and bringing consumers more trust where they can get something that is certified as a particular variety. That's called True Cut, and that's together with Brian Worthington, Josh Hubble, and Riley Kirk is on board with us, Evan Jodry. So kind of working together using genetic and chemotypic information to kind of smooth some of the stuff out where they're not what they seem to be, or things of that nature. And then working with MyFlora DNA, they're supporting this podcast, giving them some science direction and trying to bring visibility to their company. It's mostly pathogen testing at the moment, DNA, genomic fingerprinting, and we're kind of getting a little bit into tissue culture, which is really kind of a cool direction to go in. But we've got some really exciting products coming out, which I think the cultivators will really, really appreciate. By the time I publish this episode, we'll probably have those products out on the market. They'll pathogen panels. So
Cool.
basically, cultivate and look at a symptom and say, oh, my plants are yellow. I don't know what's causing this. Is it a pathogen or is it something else? They can get a yellow pathogen panel done where they get several tests for several pathogens all at once. And they pay one, like a single price, $18 instead of $45 for the three different pathogens. So, and we'll have a bunch of those. So, pathogen or yellow, wilting, leaf spot, mosaic, general decline, flower failure. Those are the panels that we're putting together so that cultivators can do more than one at a time and cover more of their bases. We do have the HLV shield, which is the test for the big three. So hop latent viroid, botrytis, and fusarium. So everybody's testing for HLV. So why not get the panel and just make sure that the other two are not present in your cultivation facility also. So that's what I'm
That's
doing.
that's
Um,
awesome. That's really cool.
but it's their business and they'll make money off of it. I think, I'm all about helping people and consumer safety and testing. And so having this available to be able to help cultivate safe and have clean cultivation facilities, but also save some money, I think is really important.
Yeah, because if you can prevent having to remediate anything, right? You've saved your entire harvest. So the more preventive strategies you can put in place, the better.
100%. And spending less money on a test means you can test more often, right? Instead of just testing once per grow, maybe you can test 3 times per grow, getting tested for these 3 different pathogens 3 times during your grow for the same price as 3 tests. So, yeah, finally, I'll point them towards your website and all that. And Darwin, it was, as always, amazing conversation with you. I am hoping that we'll run into each other at another conference coming up, probably maybe in June. MJ Unpacked.
Uh,
I'm assuming you're be there.
I will be. Yeah, we're doing a quality management and GMP workshop at MJ Unpacked in Atlantic City this year. Super excited for that. So if anyone's coming to MJ Unpacked in Atlantic City, sign up for the day one pre-conference GMP workshop and learn about how it can help you not only mitigate risks for your business, but help you improve your margins because we know we need better margins.
Everybody needs better. All right. So again,
Yeah.
Darby, it's been an honor and it's always such a good conversation with you. And I will see you soon.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on your podcast. I really appreciate it. if people want to follow me, I'm on LinkedIn. That's my main platform. You can find me easily from Darwin Millard or through CSQ. I really look forward to collaborating with you on more projects and maybe being able to appear again on your podcast in the future. Otherwise, just live long and process.
Thanks so much, Darwin. Have a good rest of your day.
You
Bye.
too.